Welcome to Coffee and Regs.
Hey, Ashley, delighted to meet today and discuss PRIIPs.
Here we are again
Yeah,
on the back of a highly successful webinar last week, and a big plug for those of you that haven't seen, listened, heard to, watch the webinar last week. Highly recommend it. And what I thought we'd do today is just a really high level précis of what was discussed and anything that sort of crops up on that. I know there were literally 100 questions coming our way, so we can't cover that in 2 minutes. And what I thought, just the hugely detailed content of that webinar, if we put this into a mini 2-minute overview for those that haven't seen it, and as a, I guess as a completely plug that webinar. And I think that the content was extremely detailed, and on the back of a load of client questions, we got into a lot of detail with the folks on the panel. One of the areas, just really briefly as an overview, when are things now happening? What do people know about deadlines?
yeah. So the major deadline we discussed was for the EU PRIIPs RTS, and that it's widely accepted. It's 1st of Jan 2023. Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
So that's when we go live with the PRIIPs RTS as we understand it now.
Okay. And then the next question that led on from that really was, what are we now seeing UK versus EU? Are we now seeing true diverged regimes, or can people really leverage one to the other?
Yeah, that was the big concern in the industry had been the very aggressive dates that have been put forward by the FCA. They had issued a consultation with proposed RTS with a lot of kind of A or B type paths that it might take, and they'd indicated an effective date of 1st of January 2021, or sorry, 2022, which was just too tight. Like most, you're thinking about in scope UK PRIIPs today, that just would have been an incredibly tight timeline to try and turn around. So what we've had since is a clarification that it's not going to be the 1st of January 2022, but we will receive an update on the results of the consultation and the date for the RTS in Q1 next year. And we're thinking it'll be earlier in Q1 rather than later in Q1. So that's
and at that point, we'll
huge welcome relief.
And that'll be everything we need to know then, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the other key, the other differences in the document, or the layout of the document itself, slightly different.
Yep.
Of the performance scenario, there is a proposal to remove the scenarios, replace them with narratives. That's a huge change. The other change is in the calculation of transaction cost, and the major difference there is the floor. So the UK are proposing a floor of 0, whereas the EU has proposed a floor of the minimum of explicit cost. And I think the consensus on our webinar was that the UK approach was the more rational and logical, that it made more sense, because the reality is the anti-dilution impact is real.
Yep.
And that's kind of, to an extent, is dampened by the EU approach. So it's the UK approach felt more likely to lead to a real world result. Yeah.
Yep, no, agreed. Okay, so negative costs have gone. It's just where the floor sits will vary between the two regimes.
Yeah, so UK as written today is 0. EU as written today is explicit cost.
Understood.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, given that there is still some time before we know the final version of everything, what are the big unknowns still there? What's looming that we really don't know, that we probably ought to know by now?
There's not so much that we don't know, because the ESAs have been briefing the working groups in the back end informally.
Yep.
There's been informal briefings, and lots of the odd loose ends are being tidied up through those briefings and communicated back to the industry through the working groups. So challenges, one of the big challenge was the interpretation of what appeared to be giving kind of senior priority to a regulated benchmark in terms of a proxy for a fund that didn't have a equivalent price history. But the clarification received through the kind of back channels in the ESAs is that Well, a fund with an existing share class has a price history that you can use. And so that was a fear firms had. Clearly, the big kind of warning or alarm bell for firms is the funds with not enough history, because heretofore with the PRIIPs, let's call it 1.0, for a daily priced fund, that was 2 years minimum. And there is always a percentage of funds with less than 2 years. But going forward, for the vast majority of funds, assuming an RHP of 5 years, they will require 10 years of history. A lot more funds are going to will fail to have a 10-year history. So that was quite a concern. And still one thing, and we know ourselves from 2017 and the run into January 18, the major issue we ran into was clients who were not ready to give and create proxies. And it was a massive list for many firms. They didn't have a price master. They didn't have a way of blending. They just were not prepared for the volume of work that was required. And this time they need to be, because there will be a lot more funds that need this work, and it will be for a longer time series. It's five times the length. And I suspect it won't be, it will not be a case of, because say the minimum length is 5 times longer, I actually think the number of funds will be a lot more than times 5.
Agreed. I know that formed the basis of so many questions flying in through the webinar last week. That's a huge concern. So I guess, early alarm bells from us to our clients and the wider prospective sort of audience as well is look at the history. That's going to be where so much legwork is needed.
Yeah, and the other thing people forget quickly, unfortunately, on the vendor, I didn't still have it. It's still very fresh.
Still got scars.
The scars is the production of the EPT. So, on November 2nd, the working group put forward the draft in public for public consultation for the EPT2. And that's very important that people read that. So that's available on the FinDatX website. It's very important that people read it and they feed back on their observations and concerns. And the industry need to be mindful that while it doesn't have an official start date, the reality is, given the RTS effective compliance date of 1st of January 2023, the IDD distributors that have existing in-scope PRIIPs today will be expecting. So if I have a unit, or if I am an insurer with a unit-linked fund wrapping a UCIT, I will need your EPT 1st of October next year.
Yep.
That's the challenge. That is the challenge that firms need to get around their heads, that the date is not the 1st of January 23. The date is 1st of October.
3 months before. Absolutely. All right, no worries. Let's leave it there for today. Well, I think 3 actions. Get onto the FinDatX website, give you feedback on the proposed changes and template updates. Start thinking about, or not start thinking about, start actioning, accumulating history for those where you don't have it. And the third action is watch the webinar from last week, because there is an awful lot more data and information in there. It was an excellent webinar.
They're all with very different backgrounds and lots of different perspectives on the challenges at play. So it's definitely worth the listen.
Excellent. We'll leave it there. Thanks as always, Ronan.
You're welcome. Thank you, Ashley.
This has been another episode of Coffee and Regs.